The city at night has a sound most people never notice. It's not the traffic or the sirens or the faint thrum of subway rails. It's the hum of the buildings themselves. Air systems breathing, lights buzzing, glass whispering as it cools against the dark. I used to sit in my office long after everyone left, surrounded by those sounds, watching the reflection of my desk lamp stretch across the window onto a skyline I'd helped defend more times than I could count. 50 victories, 50 trials, each one a cornerstone that kept this company standing while others crumbled. Every late hour, every sleepless night, every line of cross-examination carved out of me, stacked into an empire of wins. My name became synonymous with survival. My name is Daniel Cade. I'm 52 years old, and I serve as Chief Litigation Counsel for Halverson Dynamics, a multinational firm that built its fortune on energy infrastructure. For 20 years, my office sat on the 31st floor, right above the city's pulse, and I thought I'd die there, with a pen in one hand and a verdict slip in the other. I'd earned that certainty, or at least I thought I had. The boardroom that morning was glass and steel, polished to a shine that made everything look cleaner than it really was. 12 directors seated around a walnut table, their reflections sharp in the surface. I stood at the end, reviewing our last quarter's litigation report, still warm from the printer. 50 court cases in 8 years, 0 losses, billions saved in damages. I expected the usual nods, the half smiles that meant they didn't really understand the blood that went into every one of those numbers. Instead, she leaned forward. The new CEO, 25 years old, fresh from Stanford, hailed as a visionary disruptor by magazines that thought buzzwords were business models. She wore her confidence like armor and her disdain like perfume. Her voice carried easily across the table, smooth and deliberate. Daniel, you've been here a long time, and we appreciate that. But we've reviewed your position, and frankly, she paused just long enough to make sure every eye was on me. You're holding us back. The words didn't sting immediately. They landed with the weight of something rehearsed, practiced in front of a mirror. I blinked once, certain I'd misheard. Then she smiled, small, sharp, triumphant. I glanced at the directors. No one moved. No one spoke. Silence was consent. She went on. We've already found your replacement. Someone with fresh ideas, who understands the new culture we're building here. She gestured toward the door, and in walked a kid. 23 maybe, jeans, sneakers, latte still in his hand. I'd seen him once before, behind the counter of the cafe across the street. He grinned like he'd won a lottery ticket. Hard work is overrated, he said, sliding into the chair beside her. It echoed inside me, sharp as a gunshot. Hard work is overrated. I had scars on my body from collapsing in courthouse hallways. I had lost friends, marriages, pieces of myself in the name of that overrated work. And now I was being dismissed for a barista with a quip. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. Rage would have been expected. Desperation would have been easy. Instead, I set the report down gently, smoothed the corner with my thumb, and nodded once. Understood. I packed my briefcase slowly, methodically, like I was closing a case file for the last time. My pen, my notes, the small framed photo of my daughter on her law school graduation day. I buttoned my jacket, turned toward the window one last time, and let the skyline burn itself into memory. When I walked out, no one stopped me. No one thanked me. The elevator doors closed on their silence. But silence has always been my weapon. What they didn't know was that I'd been carrying it for years, sharpening it on every betrayal I'd ever seen in court, every lie that fell apart under cross-examination. I'd learned that the loudest man in the room loses first. The quiet one is the one who waits, who listens, who lets the rope slip tighter around the other man's neck. So I left quietly, not broken, not beaten, waiting. The first night after they fired me, I didn't drink. I didn't scream into the walls or tear apart my apartment. I sat in the dark, suit jacket still buttoned, watching the skyline from my 13th floor window as the city exhaled neon. Her words replayed in my head, not as an open wound, but as a recording I could pause, rewind, study. "You're holding us back," delivered like a verdict. The smug grin of the kid she called my replacement still hovered there too, latte cup dangling from his hand, eyes shining with the arrogance of someone who thought success could be frothed like milk. Most men would have drowned in anger, but anger is wasteful. I learned long ago that fury fogs the lens. Precision requires calm. I've spent my life dismantling lies, not just in courtrooms, where every question is a scalpel, but in boardrooms and back channels, where predators dressed as businessmen plotted their raids. They called me Chief Litigation Counsel because it looked clean on a plaque. But that wasn't the whole truth. I wasn't just an attorney. I was a strategist, trained to read the currents of hostile takeovers, organized financial crime, and the kind of corporate espionage that never makes the news because the right people pay to keep it quiet. My record of 50 victories wasn't coincidence. It was survival. Each win was another corpse buried in a place no one would dig. I stood up slowly, my body stiff from hours of stillness, and crossed to the bookshelf that lined my wall. A row of casebooks and legal encyclopedias collected dust there, meant to give guests the impression of a scholar's den. But the law is never bound by leather. I pressed my fingers against the far right shelf, slid out an old volume of Blackstone's commentaries, and heard the quiet click of the latch. The shelf tilted inward. Behind it was the archive. The room wasn't large, just a recessed alcove I'd gutted when I bought the apartment, but it held everything that mattered. Rows of hard drives stacked in climate-controlled racks, sealed files bound in coded tabs, a safe with backup contracts, and sealed affidavits. Surveillance reports I'd compiled myself, the kind no company handbook ever asked for. I never trusted the board, not fully, and I especially didn't trust her. Halverson Dynamics wasn't a company. It was a carcass with vultures circling, and I had the instinct to smell rot before the others noticed. I powered up one of the drives and pulled the files I'd flagged months ago, long before the board ever whispered about new direction. Patterns surfaced like bruises under pale skin. Her personal accounts showed deposits from shell companies tied to out-of-country investors. Not one or two, but dozens, layered like Russian dolls to blur the origin. Communications, encrypted but sloppy, with venture groups known for gutting firms and selling off the pieces to the highest bidder. And tucked into one folder was correspondence with a man I recognized from a past case, an asset stripper with a history of vanishing entire pensions. The barista wasn't a prodigy. He was a pawn. A puppet dangled in front of the board while she siphoned the marrow from the bones. I leaned back in the chair, the hum of the hard drive filling the silence. Every instinct urged me to march back into that glass tower, drop the evidence on the boardroom table, and watch her empire collapse under the weight of her own greed. But silence teaches patience. Timing is the blade. A knife swung too early cuts nothing but air. So I set the first traps, quiet, invisible, designed to look like chance. I rerouted her emails into a shadow archive, slipped legal tripwires into dormant contracts that would trigger the moment she moved too fast. I built paper trails that led nowhere but back to her, each one indistinguishable from the real thing. To anyone else, they'd look like routine discrepancies, the kind of clerical mess every company generates. To me, they were fuse wires, waiting for the spark. I stared at the glowing monitors, the city's reflection bouncing in the glass, and felt the familiar pressure building. It was the same sensation before cross-examination, when the jury leaned forward, desperate for me to strike. But I didn't. Not yet. I let the tension hang, because tension is a weapon too. She thought she had replaced me. She thought silence meant defeat, but silence is only the sound of the noose tightening. The announcement came wrapped in champagne and camera flashes. She stood on a stage 3 stories high, framed by LED screens that pulsed with slogans about disruption and reinvention, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd never been tested in blood. Reporters leaned forward like disciples at a sermon, scribbling notes about the fearless young CEO who was reshaping Halverson Dynamics for the future. The board flanked her, nodding at every phrase, their suits catching the light, while waiters drifted through the crowd with glasses of sparkling wine. It was theater, every second of it. The kind designed to trick shareholders into believing noise was progress, and glitter was substance. I watched from a distance, not in the ballroom, but on a live stream, the feed framed by the glow of my monitors. Untouchable. That was the image she sold, and for a moment the world seemed to buy it. But the thing about illusions is they rely on silence, and I had no intention of staying silent forever. I didn't need to bring the building down in one swing. That's not how you dismantle a structure like hers. You test the beams, listen for the groan of hidden strain, and then you pick the weakest joint. One leak. That's all it took. I crafted it with precision, stripped of context, designed to look accidental rather than intentional. A single document, an expense ledger buried in a quarterly report that most analysts skimmed over. It showed a discrepancy, small enough to be dismissed as clerical error, large enough to spark questions in the right mind. I packaged it with no signature, no trace, and dropped it into the inbox of a journalist I knew still cared more about truth than favors. The first headline appeared 48 hours later. Financial questions cloud Halverson's new direction. The piece was cautious, speculative, padded with the word alleged to keep the lawyers at bay. But the bite was there. Investors read those words differently than the public. They don't see alleged, they see risk, and risk is poison to capital. The next morning, trading volume surged. Shares dipped 2 points. Not catastrophic, not even close, but the boardroom would have felt it like a chill under the door. She held a press conference within hours, standing tall, hair perfect, her laugh effortless. "Disruption comes with turbulence," she said, leaning into the microphone as if turbulence was part of the plan. The crowd chuckled. The cameras loved it. She smirked like she'd already won. I watched her performance twice, then a third time, studying every inflection, every casual shrug. It was convincing, I'll admit. To the untrained eye, she looked unshaken. But turbulence doesn't sink ships. Holes below the waterline do, and I'd already started drilling. That night, I returned to the archive, scrolling through the layers of her network like a surgeon, tracing veins before an incision. I saw the shell companies again, the accounts moving money in circles that never closed. I traced her correspondence with the foreign investors who wanted Halverson gutted for parts. Each thread wound tighter, each name tied to another shadow I recognized from past battles. The web was fragile, stretched too thin, and I had the scissors. Still, I didn't cut. Not yet. The audience, the shareholders, the press, even the public, was leaning forward now, breath held, waiting to see what came next. But patience is leverage. One story wasn't enough to sink her. I wanted the crack to spread, invisible at first, until one day the entire facade gave way in a single shuddering collapse. So I stayed calm, even as the headlines multiplied, even as her smile grew sharper under the weight of forced charm. I thought back to trials where I'd watched witnesses unravel on the stand, not from the first question but from the fifth, the sixth, the one that circled back when they thought they were safe. That's how you destroy someone like her, not with fire, but with erosion. Quiet, steady, merciless erosion. What I hadn't revealed yet was the weapon she couldn't survive. Not the ledgers, not the shell companies, not even the offshore accounts. There was something bigger. Proof that would not only ruin her, but erase her credibility so thoroughly that even her allies would scatter. I kept that close, hidden, waiting. Because when you strike a pretender, you only get one chance. And when I moved, there would be no recovery. Only the sound of everything she built collapsing into dust. The first letter arrived on thick cream stationery, embossed with Halverson Dynamics' new logo. A cease and desist order, written with the arrogance of someone who thought ink on paper could erase history. It accused me of defamation, breach of confidentiality, malicious interference. I read it once, twice, then fed it through the shredder without a second thought. She was trying to silence me with legal smoke, forgetting that I had built my life inside those same walls. Every clause she leaned on was one I'd drafted, every threat recycled from a playbook I'd authored years ago. She was swinging a borrowed sword, and she didn't even know it was blunt. When that didn't work, whispers started. Former colleagues forwarded me emails, accidentally, copied to the wrong threads, remarks about how I'd burned out, how I was unstable since my divorce, how no firm in the city would ever take me on again. Blacklist. The word slithered through the grapevine like poison. But gossip is just noise, and noise can't touch someone who already lives in silence. I filed every rumor, every attempt at character assassination, into a folder I labeled kindling. Sooner or later, it would all burn. Outside her carefully staged press conferences, the pressure began to show. Journalists kept digging into the discrepancy I'd released, their curiosity sharpening with every evasive answer she gave. Regulators sniffed around the filings, requesting clarifications, demanding revisions. The board shifted in their chairs during quarterly calls, their smiles too stiff, their eyes too quick to dart toward the numbers that no longer balanced. The employees, the ones who used to whisper respect when I walked the halls, now whispered fear. They saw the cracks long before the headlines did. And then there was him, the barista turned executive. They shoved him in front of cameras for an interview, probably thinking his youth and charm would soften the edges of doubt. Instead, it was carnage. He stumbled over the most basic questions about quarterly revenue, confused EBITDA with net profit, and at one point admitted he wasn't much of a math guy. The clip spread online like wildfire, memed into oblivion, dissected by analysts, mocked by late-night hosts. He'd been her symbol of the future, but symbols can cut both ways. Now he was the face of incompetence, the punchline to every investor's joke. I watched it unfold with the same stillness I once held in a courtroom while a hostile witness unraveled. Calm, unshaken. My heart rate barely shifted. This wasn't luck. It was the geometry of collapse, predictable if you'd studied enough ruins. She thought she was still in control, but control is just perception. One more move, and the illusion would shatter completely. The call came at 2:14 a.m., the hour when the city goes quiet and the only lights burning are the ones that matter. An encrypted channel, old frequencies I hadn't heard in years. The voice on the other end belonged to Carter, a contact from corporate intelligence who owed me favors from a case we'd both survived in Houston. He didn't waste time with greetings. "It's confirmed," he said. "She's laundering investor funds. Shell companies in Zurich and Macau. They're moving money through art acquisitions, routing it back into Halverson as consulting fees. We've tracked the cycles 3 times. Ironclad." I sat back, letting the words settle like a stone in still water. This wasn't a discrepancy or sloppy accounting. This was fraud on a level that didn't just stain reputations. It ended careers, triggered indictments, shattered entire networks. It was the kind of crime that puts handcuffs on wrists and headlines on front pages. I thanked him, encrypted the files he sent, and loaded them into my archive. The temptation to press send, to unleash it all, was sharp and immediate. One keystroke and she would be finished, her empire reduced to ash, her allies scattering like rats. I could already picture the look on her face as the walls closed in. But I didn't release it. Not yet. Timing, I reminded myself, is everything. You don't fire when the target is moving erratically. You wait for the breath between steps, the heartbeat where they think they're safe. That's when the shot lands. So I waited. The city outside my window pulsed with neon, oblivious to the noose tightening around its latest darling. She thought she was still playing offense. She thought she could silence me with letters and whispers, but she didn't understand. I was already aiming. The boardroom smelled of glass cleaner and fear. The walls were too polished, the table gleamed like a surgical slab, and the air conditioning hummed louder than it should have. Directors shuffled papers they didn't need to read, clearing throats, glancing toward the double doors as if salvation would enter with her. She was late, deliberately, because power likes to be theatrical. I was already there, seated at the far end, not as counsel, not as employee, just as the shadow they thought they'd exorcised weeks ago. My briefcase sat by my chair, locked and humming with the weight of inevitability. At precisely 9 o'clock, she swept in. Hair sculpted, heels clicking, smile bright enough to blind the timid. She carried herself like a monarch, nodding once to the board before sliding into the chair at the head. Beside her trailed the barista, trying to look important, his shirt still wrinkled from some half-hearted ironing. Cameras from the in-house media team adjusted their angles, ready to capture the queen and her court. She inhaled, preparing to launch into her carefully rehearsed speech about growth, vision, disruption. That was the moment I pressed the button. The flood was immediate, coordinated down to the second. Regulators received packets of data so thick they could drown in them. Wire transfers, shell company registrations, art auction records, with her signature hidden in the margins. Investors' inboxes erupted with proof that their money had been siphoned into her personal empire. Journalists, half of them already circling from the previous leak, were suddenly fed the entire carcass, blood still dripping. Screens lit up across the city as headlines broke faster than the markets could breathe. In that boardroom, the collapse began with a phone vibrating, then another. Then the first director's face drained of color as he scrolled through a message that changed his world in real time. Murmurs turned to gasps, gasps to shouts. One man stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. "What is this?" he barked, his voice cracking with panic. The barista shifted in his seat, stammering something about fake news, but the cameras had already turned toward him like vultures. She tried to steady the room, raising a manicured hand, her smile trembling at the edges. "This is noise. she declared, louder than necessary. Sabotage from a bitter ex-employee. We knew this might happen, but her phone buzzed again, and this time she couldn't ignore it. I watched her eyes flicker as she read the words that would haunt her. SEC investigation initiated. Freeze in progress. Trading halted within minutes. Investors screamed into phones, demanding answers no one could give. Employees, sensing blood, stormed into the hallways downstairs, chanting, shoving, recording every second on their devices. Lawsuits filed electronically before the meeting even ended. And somewhere across the city, federal agents began printing arrest warrants, with her name already inked. She looked at me then. The room had dissolved into chaos. Directors shouting, security staff uncertain whether to stay or run, cameras capturing the end of her reign. But her eyes locked on mine, wide with disbelief, sharp with the realization that this wasn't a stumble. It was an execution. Her lips parted, and she whispered it like a prayer. "You did this?" I rose slowly, leaning across the table until my reflection met hers in the polished surface. My voice was steady, each word a verdict. I defended this company 50 times in court. This was 51. The silence that followed was louder than the shouting. It was the silence of a gavel striking, of history closing its book. She slumped back into her chair, her empire burning around her, no lifelines left to grasp. The barista bolted for the door, forgotten before it even shut behind him. The board scattered like roaches under light, and she sat alone, crown of ash on her head, staring at the ruin she had built with her own hands. There would be no sequel, no redemption arc, only headlines, indictments, and the long, slow grind of justice. Utter annihilation, sealed before the ink dried. I left the boardroom without looking back, the din of collapse chasing me down the hallway. Outside, the city air felt sharper, cleaner, as though something toxic had been scrubbed from it. I walked toward the elevator, briefcase in hand, not triumphant, not vengeful. Simply finished. Some people believe betrayal deserves forgiveness. Others believe it demands revenge. But I know the truth. Betrayal is a pattern, as old as trade, as deep as trust itself. It appears in marriages, in governments, in boardrooms like this one. And every time, it ends the same way. Not with a scream, but with silence. Because silence is the only sound strong enough to bury the liars for good.